Hello, welcome to Qualitatively Speaking. I'm Ashley Krejci Shaw, and thank you for tuning in either live or watching this later. I appreciate you. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Christine Culp. Christine is someone that I met about 3.5 or so years ago. We met and we first spoke over the phone. And one thing that struck me about Christine was just how clear and concise she was in her allyship, uh, in regard to students in the South Carolina public school system. But I was also very taken by her understanding when it comes to the experiences of Black students in South Carolina and her overall sort of head and heart balance, and her empathy for what it means to be an African American person, sort of living with the legacy of oppression in a place like South Carolina. So, with that being said, one of the reasons I invited Christine to speak with us today and to have a discussion is really, I shared with her some of the projects I had on the go and talked to her about what it was like to be working on a project in which we discussed narrative and missing narratives, and to realize that there didn't seem to be a lot of discussion about the experiences of Asian American people. And so Christine is with us not just because she's an educational advocate, but also she's an Asian American woman of color. And so I'm very grateful to say that she is here to share with us, talk with us. And with that being said, I'm going to bring her into the stream now. Hello.
Hi.
How are you? I'm good. I'm good. How's it going? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I did a little bit of an intro. I explained a little bit about how long I've known you, why I asked you to be a part of Qualitatively Speaking, and I'm very grateful. Thank you so much for being here. Before I get into any more detail, I'm going to give you a proper introduction. So we're going to go ahead and read your bio. So you were born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is California, to immigrant parents. Where are your parents from originally?
They are both from South Korea. My father, though, he actually grew up in an orphanage in Korea until he was about 10 years old. And then he was adopted by a family in Pennsylvania. So he spent then the latter part of his years in Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So you received your bachelor's in English literature from the University of California, Berkeley, and you have a master's in secondary education, curriculum, and instruction from the University of Missouri. Prior to joining the nonprofit educational space, you taught high school English, and then there's a point to say all grades except for 10th grade. I don't know what can you explain that to me? Because I kind of laughed, but I didn't know what I was laughing about.
Yeah, so I always make this distinction between I loved my ninth graders, love them, and also they were sort of like children in adult, growing adult bodies. And so there was just this distinction between teaching ninth graders and then teaching 11th and 12th graders who were really just like on their way to coming into their own and who they were going to be. And so I always found it interesting that I missed that that middle step in that 10th grade step.
Okay, got it. Thank you for explaining it. So that was in St. Louis, Missouri, and then you taught briefly in Washington, D.C. So you came to South Carolina in 2013, and of course, you're currently working in an educational-based nonprofit. You've had various roles in teacher leadership development, from directly coaching first and second year teachers to designing programming and training for teachers through the lens of instructional excellence, culturally relevant pedagogy, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. At present, you lead a team of teachers, leadership development coaches, and manage the scope of development for them as leaders for equity in education. So there we go. So again, thank you so much for being here. So when I reached out to you, Christine, I was, as I explained before, I was wrapping up some projects. I have some new projects on the go, and so much of my work has focused on, looking at neglected narratives. And then also asking questions about why certain people or groups are just not believed about their experience. And so as I have been doing so much of this work, and this has really been, with COVID-19 being so prominent and just being such a factor in all of our lives, these stories of like anti-Asian hate and violence and sadly even death that has been attached to this awful racism, I feel like I don't hear and see enough stories about the experiences of Asian Americans, especially in South Carolina. And I suppose part of that has to be because there's a very low number. This is a very small community in South Carolina. Um, I think it's as few as 2%, but it's certainly less than 5. And so knowing you, not just as an advocate, one thing that struck me about you when we first got to know each other was that you were just so certain of things that you knew, things that you didn't know, particularly when it came to the Black struggle and the Black struggle that continues, as we know. So let's pause there for a minute. I'm going to put a pin in there. What was it like to be asked just to even talk about your experience? Let's start there.
It's really interesting that that is your first question. I was surprised. I mean, in the many reasons why you may have reached out to me to chat, that actually was not something that crossed my mind. I have definitely been, obviously been following the news as I shared my family and my parents are in California, and that is where a lot of the most publicized incidents have been happening. So there was also just like this like awareness and this like real visceral fear for like, oh, what is happening, with my parents, especially with my mother, who is currently she works as a nurse. She's at the times beyond just like that background part of my life. It actually had not been my identity and what was happening worldwide, and specifically the rhetoric in our country around my identity was not something that I actually just on a day-to-day basis thought about. And in particular, I didn't really think about it through the context of the work that I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is actually probably a really good place to even share what was sort of the impetus for me. So you and I were in a sort of a group training, cultural training, and we were sort of in this large sea, but you and I were seated beside each other at the same table. And so we were participating sort of as a team or group. And I can't remember exactly what the question was, but we were all asked to answer a series of questions and then share them with everybody. And perhaps what really triggered me and in my memory was when it was your time to share, and you said that I realized that when people first see me, the first thing that they see is that I'm Asian, and so I'm sitting beside you, and I know it's like I grew up in a white Canadian town, so I know what it's like to walk in and be just one little dot in a sea of white faces, and I understand what it's like for people to first see your color or some sort of distinguishing feature about you or something. But when you said that, I was sitting beside you and I just went, and I had to think like, is that what I first saw when I saw you? And to be honest, I don't know even if it was, but I certainly noticed. And so at some point I wanted to have a discussion about that, but I didn't know like where does that where would that fit at that moment? And it didn't. And so I just sort of moved on. But certainly, given COVID and how COVID has exacerbated, obviously, existing bigotry against Asian people, it just seemed fitting and proper to have a conversation about it now. And so I'm always talking about like, even though there's not always a large number of people present, we always have to be very cognizant and aware that there are multiple narratives happening, at once. And so, one question I had for you was: so, as an Asian American professional whose work is centered mainly on understanding institutional discrimination, racism, and oppression against Black South Carolinians, are you surprised or even concerned about the interest or lack of understanding about bigotry and violence against Asian Americans?
Oh, that's a big question. So actually going back to what you shared about that moment where when I was sharing that, I'm very aware when people look at me that the first thing that they see is that I'm Asian. I actually didn't remember saying that, and I actually thought a lot about it after you had mentioned that to me when we first spoke. And it's interesting because I actually think that what I likely meant in the moment when I said it is actually now very different than what it might mean now. When I think about being aware of my Asianness and where I often sit, and in the places where I often am and in the work that I do, a lot of times I am pushing myself into that awareness because I understand that the majority of the folks that I work with and the students that I'm serving and the communities that I'm serving are primarily Black and Brown communities. And so when I walk into a room and am purporting to talk about or purporting to share that, I am doing this work and I'm, working in Black and Brown communities, I want to ensure that I'm always keeping front and center that that yes, so that one, that they see the visceral identity of like that I am Asian, and also knowing what I know about the history of systemic oppression, that when I walk into a room, there is an entire story and history that I bring with me that lots of times I might not even be aware of, right? And so for me, a lot of that is, and that push for me to really keep that front and center in my mind and aware of that, actually, I think came from this sort of evolution in how I really ended up in, the past 10 years of my life working primarily in Black and Brown communities and in serving Black and Brown communities and being really careful and aware of the history that I might be bringing with me just through the phenotype of like what I look like.
Mhm. Explain that. Can you tease that out just like a little bit more? You're talking about the experiences I'm bringing with me. I feel like I kind of understand, but I don't think a lot of people do. I mean, this is not, I mean, like cultural trainings and self-reflection and, the raising of metacognition is not like mandatory. And even with our previous administration, we saw there was an attack on this idea of learning about critical race theory and self-examination. And thankfully, that's not a battle we have to fight right now. But can you just explore that a little bit for folks who don't really understand what that might mean? Like bringing
Yes.
with you.
Yeah. So I think there's like several things here, right? So I think there is the more just general narrative of non-Black folks oftentimes leading in, what they want to be social justice spaces and actually ending up doing a lot of harm because it's oftentimes fraught with a lot of white saviorism and just in other ways like taking the forefront and taking the lead on issues and problems that there is no way that they can actually understand in all of its complexity and nuance because they don't have that perspective. And so, essentially, yes, I might not be white, but in a lot of ways, I don't think that even matters because there's just this like sense of like, well, you're not Black, and because of that, like you wanting to lead or purporting to lead in this way in work and in a community and in an issue that primarily affects us, right? Like that's something that I have to make sure to be really cognizant of because I don't have that perspective, and I can't ever. If I ever catch myself trying to, purport myself to be in any way an expert or knowing anything, I have to really quickly, make sure that I'm really pushing myself to get myself out of that mindset. So that's the first sort of like more general, I think, history. And then more specifically, when we think about what is most dominantly shared as like a dominant narrative, there historically has been some tension. I say some, you could also say it as a lot of tension between Black communities and Asian communities. And I say that that's a dominant narrative because there actually also is a very, very complex history of solidarity and alliances between Black communities and Asian communities. But that history is not one that is often talked about or shared. The one that's most dominant that's shared is the one where there is a lot of tension. With Asian folks oftentimes being unaware of and perpetuating a lot of anti-Blackness. And so that is also something that I'm bringing to the table, right? Like that is especially potentially coming to communities where there may not be a large population of Asian folks. I might be speaking to somebody whose only interaction with an Asian person was a negative one. And even though that's not something that I can, technically be responsible for, it's still something in the context of, how interpersonal and systemic racism works in our society that I have to be aware of in any situation.
That's great. Thank you. After we spoke, thank you for mentioning this thing of tension and there being sort of like this cross cultural bias, and I had to, like, I started cataloging all of the like stereotypes and negative stuff that I think I've absorbed over time in regard to Asian people. Now, this was actually brought in by when we talked in preparation for this discussion. We had like a very, just casual conversation. You brought up some things about cultural appropriation, and it triggered me. And I was like, well, let me just really think about this. And I was really the list is quite long. Not because I feel or obviously believe them, but I mean when we talk about sort of what you collect and just how things are planted in your mind, and I'm like, they're there. I don't believe it, but they're around, and there's a lot of assumptions. So I have to ask, like, and you just said something that sort of brought on this question: is do you think that there was as an Asian American person growing up in this country, do you think that there was any anti-Blackness in your community that you felt and had to investigate and work through? Because so often when we have this conversation, Christine, we're talking to white people. And so we understand the narrative on the white side about how there's like implicit and explicit bias. But as an Asian American woman, this is a good question. Like, did you have to explore that a little bit about how things have sort of stuck on you potentially or possibly?
Yeah, so I firmly believe that that racism and anti-Blackness is, to use like Dr. Beverly Tatum's analogy of like the air that you breathe, it's in the air that you breathe. And so when I'm often in racial development and identity development spaces, and there are always questions around like, well, can you think of a time that you perpetuated oppression? And it's interesting because my response to that in my head is always, I can think about a million times, because every day I probably likely do something that perpetuates oppression. And that is a part of that system and that cycle that I'm not conscious of and that I'm not aware of. So I think that's the first place that I always want to start, where I actually never want to get to a place where I am, and in my mind, I almost see it as an arrogance, right? Of like that me as an individual, that I can say that I have successfully suppressed conditioning and socialization that has been occurring since, I was a baby, since I, first saw the world around me. And so that's the first place that I want to start. But absolutely, I don't think that it is. It's interesting because in some ways I'm even like feeling myself feeling almost like reluctant to say it like so boldly, but there absolutely is anti-Blackness in
Hard.
Asian communities.
It's hard. It's hard.
Mhm.
I'm telling you, when I was like, when you were talking to me about like what you yes, I'm thinking, yes, I know of these things. I know, and it's even in a private moment, it's hard to even acknowledge that those are within you, and it's even harder when you don't believe it. But there's like this unconscious stuff that's going on that you have to work through. So anyways, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that. And because so when we talk about education in South Carolina and we talk about the challenges that exist for students, typically we are talking about the challenges that exist primarily for Black students, and we know this like quantitatively through stats and data. I'm curious to know, is there like in all of your travels around South Carolina and all of your experiences, I understand that we do not have a huge Asian population, but have you had any experiences or detected or can share narratives from like Asian students, students as you kind of travel around? So I know that you do go many different places. Are there anything you can share or or any experiences?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and really, I don't, in some ways, I'm almost too removed from just like the everyday of classrooms that I don't know if I feel like I have enough of a nuanced perspective to really share anything.
Yeah.
Um, I do believe, I mean, just in thinking about like what it means for folks, in schools, and to, think about like how they are represented, if they see people who look like them, if their cultural values are represented in, in just how like the accepted ways of being in school. Um, there absolutely is, just this there's not as much, I think, of an understanding around how difficult that it can sometimes be to navigate, a white dominant culture when I think that you are Asian American. I know that, when I think about ways in which I may have experienced marginalization myself, a
Yes.
lot of the times it actually comes from folks, assuming that, that assimilating into like a white dominant, professional culture, for example, is easy for me, when
Mm.
actually the majority of the values and ways of being that, are attributed to success in a white dominant professional culture are actually antithetical, to many of my most natural ways of being, and my most important values. One thing that is so little, and it's so little, but I really, have gravitated towards thinking about this because it really makes me think about the little ways in which it's important to really build cultural competence, because it is in those little interactions that cultural competence actually lives.
Mhm.
But one thing that I've always found, really interesting and troubling is that oftentimes Asian students have a really difficult time, engaging in classroom, experiences that require a lot of dialogue or require a lot of discussion when there aren't set rules. And a lot of that actually comes from like, it's actually very uncomfortable for me when there's a discussion happening to try to figure out how to insert myself into the discussion. Because there's always like a couple of beats, then I wait, and then somebody else takes over, and then it doesn't feel relevant, and then I wait for everyone to speak. And that's just, I think, like something that I've seen oftentimes happen, even with like when we're training our teachers, something that folks aren't aware of. And I know it's just like a really small example, but it's one that was really, really poignant for me when I heard about it.
I don't think it's small. I think there's been lots of studies and work done on this. I don't think it's
Mhm,
high context cultures or
mhm,
low context cultures.
mhm.
What even like eye contact means for one group opposed to another. So I think that's what you are actually referring to. So that's really good to know. Do you think you've observed that even in South Carolina among Asian students? Like I'm also trying to get a sense of like the community of students here in South Carolina. And I'm only asking because I know that in some ways you get to kind of survey that just a little bit, maybe in your observations. Like, is there a sense that that's a common or yeah, like a common experience among Asian South Carolinian youth here?
I don't think I have enough specifics to say that.
Yeah.
I do know that oftentimes, I think like when teachers have spoken about their Asian students, oftentimes there's just a sense of like how, I feel bad because they can't fit in, but I'm not really sure how to help them.
Mm.
Um, as you probably know, a lot of schools in South Carolina, especially in rural South Carolina, have like pretty set. I mean, there's either, a like subconscious segregation that happens from, just like how, academic policies are, laid out in schools. So, for example, IB programs often, are full of white students, and the non-IB programs are full of Black students, not because of any difference in actual academic aptitude, but because of like systemic, educational inequity. But, there is sort of like just this culture of having your people, right? And then, I know that a huge experience that, that teachers have shared with me is like, I don't know how to really help them to fit in. there have also been a lot of experiences too, where if they are new to the US, of what it looks like to actually teach someone who who is learning English as a second language, and all of the biases that come with that, most often actually with teachers lowering expectations and actually not being able to see how competent and capable that student can be, just because they may not have the English proficiency just yet.
Sure enough. So again, this seems to be following this theme of like numbers and representation. So you're from a state where obviously there's larger Asian community population. It's California. So you didn't grow up in a place where I'm assuming you felt alone or as though there weren't people around who looked like you. Do you have some sense of what non-Asian South Carolinians are missing, or what we neglect about supporting communities of color that may not be, again, quantitatively represented or visible to us?
So I think there are a couple of things that I want to share here. I think the first piece, and this is sort of more big picture, there oftentimes does there are oftentimes this narrative that starts to unfold around like a and it almost feels like as like a zero sum game, where it's like, oh well, if we focus too much on Latinx issues or Black issues, then like why don't we focus on Asian issues, and where are they, why don't we talk about Asian people, and I know where that is coming from, and I know why that narrative feels really important sometimes. And also, I really want to push folks to think about um, race and racism through the way in which that it was constructed in the US. And it truly was constructed under the logic of anti-Blackness, with white and Black being bookends and everybody else being the middle. And no, that is not, to take away from the uniqueness and the individuality of like your culture and who you are, but that, is like those are the parameters that we were fit into, that is like actually like really disgusting and inequitable. And that's part of what we're trying to fight, right?
Right.
But I say all of that to say that I think sometimes what we forget when we're so focused on this narrative of like, well, like, somebody needs my specific issue, or this specific issue needs to gain more traction. I think what we forget is that oftentimes when we are fighting for to end anti-Blackness and to dismantle anti-Blackness, that actually benefits everyone. And that is something that history has shown us. And that is something that, like, when we think about like what is happening in our country today, that is also something that I believe. So I think that's the first thing that I want to say. I think the second thing, though, is that when I see a huge gap in terms of just like understanding Asian experience, I don't think it even is specific to South Carolina. I think this is true even of places where there might be higher populations of Asian folks, is that the narrative of our experience, our history, is like almost like, a fringe, interest. It's not something that even Asian folks are always aware of. I wasn't aware of the history of Asian Americans in the US, our history of resistance in the US. I wasn't aware of that until probably college, when I was able to actually gain access to different texts. But that's something that is, I think, really sorely missing. And so what happens then is that there is a really fraught misunderstanding of Asian folks' experience and how we have come to be in whatever way we are being right now in this country.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for, again, just, sort of, affirming in your view, as somebody who has been sort of born and raised outside of the South, coming into a culture that sometimes just feels, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. Like I said, although I have really deep roots in South Carolina, and I've always had a relationship with the Tri County, particularly North Charleston, Liberty Hill. Um, I was just very surprised when I moved down there, and as I built my life, all that I did not know. And so, truly, when I say that we have to talk more in terms of like black, white, binary, and understand that paradigm, I mean it. It really is, the original sin. It really is the place in which, like, if we can get this right, if we can get like, if we can understand this relationship, and we can actually bring healing and grow beyond that, then we can almost do anything. But I agree, and I appreciate you saying that. That means a lot, because I think that at times it's hard for people who are not African American to sort of acknowledge that. And again, part of like doing qualitatively speaking is just to be able to bring some normalcy and just some light on that fact. So in other words, what you're kind of saying, and maybe it is or maybe you're not, but it kind of sounds as though even being in South Carolina and having to learn intentionally, like almost train yourself to better understand the systemic barriers for African Americans, and then also how that sort of materializes in the educational system. I mean, how did that sort of, I don't know, did it inform you even about the inequality against Asian people? Like, was it sort of like not a foil, but did it sort of shine a light on that a little bit too?
Yes, in a lot of sort of minute little ways.
Hmm.
I mean, it's going back to sort of that like black white binary. There is also sort of this other binary that exists of Asian people being model minority and black folks being, whatever the opposite of model minority is. And that sort of distinction and that like binary also exists. And so um, it's interesting to think about the ways in which so as a really small example, right? I one thing that I can't obviously fully understand, but that my colleagues have spoken to as Black women is that there is the trope of an angry Black woman, and that there is a level of almost like having to negotiate how you show up so as not to seem um, uh, overbearing, because that can actually be interpreted in a lot of really negative ways.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because in some ways that also helped me to understand my own experience in sort of like in relationship to that, right? Because almost in the opposite way, there's this expectation of Asian women as very submissive.
Yes.
And what I've experienced is that when I am, very assertive, and when I am, in positions where, I'm really direct, I also get a lot of pushback. And I've been able to analyze that as like, actually, for me, that's almost like the opposite of like where they don't expect something and then it like really shocks them when they actually see the opposite of what they expect. So I think like with all things, right? And I think that actually really speaks to this sort of like bookend theory of like everything in terms of how our social construction of race has been, how that has been constructed, is all about how we negotiate people between white and Black, right? And that was something that I think I definitely started thinking about a lot more, and has really helped me to understand my experience.
Thank you for that. And thank you for bringing up like femininity and what it means to
Mhm.
not just be a person of color, but what it means to be a woman, of color. So in the wave of Asian violence, there was a story that I found from NBC that reported that there were about 3,800 anti-Asian acts of violence discrimination reported. But you are probably also aware that many of these cases, there's more cases against women than there are men. And so, anyways, as I was thinking about you, I was thinking like, here you are, you live in Florence County, right? Or you?
I actually just moved to Columbia last year.
Oh,
I don't know if I actually told you that.
no,
Yeah.
okay. Well, how was the big change? How was it? Different, I bet. Well, even in your time, having spent so much time in Florence, like, do you feel, have you ever felt, especially as of late, sort of like in danger? Do you feel like you are at a greater risk to be harassed or, just publicly? I mean, what we see is like all these attempts to publicly humiliate Asian people. Like, what does it feel like? Has it felt differently in the last year or so?
Yep. So I honestly have not had that experience. I also think though that a lot of that comes from a lot of just of the personal work that I have done to again like have a really clear understanding of who I am against sort of like the stereotype of what people might perceive.
Mhm.
And so I don't, I really haven't had a lot of experiences where I felt more in danger, um, really than like I think any woman in the world might feel,
Yeah.
right? What I will say is with COVID, in the beginning, I didn't really feel that different. Part of that also being that I really didn't leave my house very much.
Sure.
But as more and more reports of violence came out, um, as I just would hear, overhear every now and again, people talking about the China flu and, just people that I actually even just like had, they might not have been friends, but we were like, positive acquaintances, just, kind of throwing out words like that. I definitely started to feel maybe not more targeted, but just more visible. Um, and especially when it came to, like, I actually remember being in line, funnily enough, to get my the first shot of the vaccine. And I actually remember being like very aware of like myself and of like other people potentially being aware of me. And so in moments like that, it's just like an unconscious thing that crops up for me.
Sure. I want to talk about what it means to make one make oneself available to discourse. Like, I feel sometimes it can feel very unfair for someone or a group of people to expect you to speak about race and racism and your experiences. It's like not everybody, wants to talk about it. It's not always an appropriate time. Um, I wonder when maybe you can shed some light on this. How does it feel to, like, again, to be asked, like, if there's anyone that even knows you or doesn't know you, or knows someone who's Asian, and they want to ask questions or they want to build a relationship and just gain a greater understanding. I mean, what can you suggest, recommend, or advise, like, someone who wants to build relationships with Asian American people who might be at their workplace, be in their lives, and start like a really positive dialogue? Or, I mean, is your advice just not to, just to Google it, essentially, and then figure it out? Because also that can be very valid advice. Like, don't ask me. I mean, we have to respect, I think, this spectrum. I'm open to questions, and I would rather personally have someone ask a question respectfully, even if it's insensitive, than have them sort of investigated on their own. If there's something I can offer, then I will, from my perspective, because I don't speak for everybody. But you understand my question here, what I'm saying. There could be someone out there who they know you or don't, who wish that they could learn more, build relationships, but don't really know how. What's your thoughts on that?
I think so on my end, my fear is always in people misinterpreting, well, in misinterpretation, really. And also just like the burden of like if I feel like I misrepresented something, that means that I misrepresented something for a whole group of
Right.
people, right?
Uh,
But I think just asking the questions, and and really like asking the questions directly, like, what are you actually curious about? What do you actually want to know? I think what's interesting is that in some ways, I've always had these interactions where people are like tiptoeing around the question, and I know what they want to ask, and it's not an offensive question, but it's almost like, and it's interesting to even think that, you know, we live in a culture that wants to be so race neutral that people think that it might be offensive to ask you, you know, what your ethnicity is. I think that's just interesting, that, you know, that's one of the consequences of the fact that we try to pretend that our culture as a whole, white supremacist culture as a whole, tries to pretend like race doesn't exist, even though, you know, that's at the cornerstone of the outcomes that we see in all of our institutions. And so I think sometimes it's just asking the question and asking it directly, and being really clear about the question being for that person as an individual, because I think that's also an important thing, right? Like that's when you can sometimes teeter between this like feeling of like, oh, I'm actually like just having a conversation with someone versus I actually feel like I'm being like studied, you know?
Yes.
And so I think like that like individual connection is really important, of like, what do you want to know about me? Not as somebody who is Asian, but not just, I just want to learn about Asian people.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. So going to your work right now. So you've been in the educational game, if you will, for some time, fighting, working, building relationships, and obviously working toward progress. What can you share, and what would you like to what would you like to share about your journey in the last, say, I don't know, even 5 years? What encourages you? What changes have you seen that sort of compels you to stay, in this work and keep fighting for students in South Carolina?
I feel so convicted by this question of, and this is something that is at the center of why I want to be in education and why I want to work, particularly in the communities where we work. I don't have children currently, but that is something that, you know, that I want to be true in my future. And there's just a deep seated, like, that's not okay, of feeling like, of like any time that I'm in a classroom or anytime I'm in a school, I have to feel like, oh, I would be comfortable, I would be happy for my child to be here in this environment with these people. As you know, parents and families send their children, I mean, I know that, you know, you're a mother, right? And like parents and families, they send their children to school, wanting to believe that the school has their child's best interest in mind, that that place is going to keep their child safe. And that just has not been the reality, for Black students in particular, and students of color more widely, in our education system. And so for me, like it's just that like personal piece that is really important. I When I think about sort of, you know, the trajectory, you know, you named that, I I grew up in actually, a predominantly Asian community, a predominantly Asian community that was also, mostly upper middle class and professional. And so, you know, I think that's also an important distinction to make, because like Asian, you know, like any people, but in particular, Asian people are not a monolith because they're sort of grouped under this umbrella, when they have such a vast array of experiences in terms of like their country of origin and the reasons why they may have immigrated to the United States. But I grew up in that environment, and so my understanding of race and inequity was very intellectual, prior to actually working in education. I knew, you know, all of the the terminology. I, could write a paper on intersectionality, but again, it was very, very intellectual. And I think for me, the difference between reading about the prison industrial complex and the fact that our criminal justice system is criminalizes Black men at such a far higher rate. And reading about that is very different than actually being in a classroom and seeing a white female teacher be scared of a third grade Black male child, right? And just seeing the connection between almost seeing just like that lineage, like what that future of like why that happens in those like small moments, right? And I think the other thing that's really important there too is that most often that teacher is wholly unaware that potentially that is a bias that they may have, right? A lot of times the folks that we work with, specifically, in the organization that I'm in, have a very like conscious and direct commitment to equity and social justice. And so it's that like being able to actually understand how that anti-Blackness is something that is so conditioned by the ways that we are socialized, that's how it manifests. And so in the choices that you make every day in whatever role that you're in actually has huge implications. And so for me, it's really those small moments of being able to see the larger implications and how those play out. We always talk about oppression and inequity being systemic and institutional. And yes, that is absolutely true. But I also think that we have to always remember that people make up systems. Right. There's a quote around, racism is systemic. So even if there were no racists, the system would still turn out the same outcomes. And in one sense, like, yes, that's true. And also like, there are actual people, humans that are making decisions every day that keep that system going. Sometimes they're aware that that's what they're doing, and sometimes they're not. And I think in some ways it's like tackling the people who are not. How much can we actually change if we do that?
Thank you for all of that, because you brought on, like, you teed up this really great question, which is, based on your position and different perspectives and sort of maybe even places within your organization that you've been and your time in South Carolina, based on what you see. I mean, are you saying, or do you believe that like anti-Blackness can be combated, and again, in the context of our educational system, internally or externally? Because it exists in both places, but where do you think, or how do you think we are going to make the most progress? Where does our focus need to be? Does it need to be internally in terms of purely the public school system, or do you see maybe a different strategy being more effective outside of it?
I think that, this is, very personal, me, individual opinion. But I think that when we think about the history of oppression and how like rooted it is in everything, in every aspect of our lives, there are so many different ways that, like, different layers at which we need to tackle it, right? And so I think that for individuals who are interested and want to work for change, that want to dismantle the status quo, a lot of that is actually getting really clear on what your specific role is going to be and where you want to concentrate. And I think that all of those avenues are valid and actually have its place, and working, with all of those like sort of like different things that are happening at the same time, that they all in some way are impacting like a broader shift or a broader movement, right? It's almost like you want to, I'm trying to think of a metaphor, and I'm like, I don't know, tackling it at all sides, that always will get greater success.
Sure. Well, I'll just share that, so my personal philosophy, and one that I've set for intermediate, my business, is just that, all change is internal. It's all within the individual. And as you said before, it's not just these systems that are icy cold and HoloLens, and we are the system, all of us. And so that's why I fight so hard for raising metacognition and working on oneself, and doing the work of investigation and auditing of oneself, and which is also why it's been so wonderful to speak with you today, and to even have our rapport, and to have a professional connection with you, because one thing that bugs me still, from that moment when we shared that table, and you shared what you did, was that it was an opportunity to learn more. And for some reason, and the truth is too, I mean, I'm always looking at my own personal experience too. I don't assume that I know everything there is to know about um, my identity as a Black woman, or my place in the South, or something like that. I'm always sort of doing my research, even on myself, if you will, to better understand just how entangled and how messy our history is. But with that being said, I saw an opportunity. There was an opportunity there, and I didn't take it. And and I'm always kind of questioning why I didn't really explore that more with you, probably because I was apprehensive. What does it mean to ask you this question at this time? But anyways, with that being said, what I want to know at this point, what keeps you up at night, as a professional, as somebody who, I'm sure you probably always have some sort of relationship with education, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just assuming, maybe. But what keeps you up at night, and where do you see the fight at this point when it comes to educational equality and equity? I know.
It is, yeah.
Well, let's maybe start from.
It's just such a huge problem, right? And so sometimes I think that can just feel overwhelming. I mean, I've actually sat down at times, with colleagues, and we've been like, okay, what is going to actually create change, and equity in schools, right? If we want to just even think about schools. And it's interesting because every solution that we come upon, there's always then another sort of thing that above it that kind of then we need to tackle, and then we need to tackle that, and then we need to tackle that. And so it sort of just comes this maelstrom of okay, where do we, what is the root? How do we tackle the root? I mean, if we think about the root being racism, that, I mean, that's not something that you can change through policy decisions and through education, right?
Let me revise my question. So I always say, there's something else I always advocate for. I'm they're the three most important stakeholders in the whole public school operation. You have the children, you have the students themselves, you have families, and then to some degree the larger community, but then you have teachers. I don't even include administrators. I think it's teachers. It is the support system, the direct line with families, and of course it's the students. But I feel like all are sort of equal in a sense. It's going to take cooperation and understanding and success of all three, to actually see the kind of change that we know has to take place. Is there in your view maybe one of those particular stakeholders that perhaps may be neglected, or is there another group of stakeholders that you see in your professional experiences that maybe are not included that should be? Is that an easier question? I would think that maybe that would be more concise.
Yes, absolutely.
Did you work primarily with
yes, I work primarily with teachers. So I don't work directly with students. I see student impact through teachers. It's funny that you asked that question, what keeps me up at night? Because this actually does keep me up at night, which is how the relationship between teachers and parents and families, how that is such an opportunity that both stakeholders don't take advantage of all the time. And in a lot of ways, there's an antagonistic relationship, and sometimes, for a lot of reasons, right? And in my work with teachers and working on the teacher side of things, it's really important to really hone in on the ways that their own biases might be showing up with parents and families, the way in which they have to, especially working in the communities where we work, also understand that some communities actually have a really fraught history with that school or with that school system. And so there might actually be a lot of baggage there. Also, just understanding that, all parenting doesn't look the same, and like that actually you have to, it's not your job to actually comment on, how a family or how a parent is parenting their child, especially when there is a lot of like cultural competence issues that come up as a reason for that. And so that's something that I work on a lot with teachers. And then I also sometimes hear the parent side as well, right? With like, friends who are parents and, who are, so upset sometimes at teachers and how they treat their child, either intentionally or unintentionally. But if teachers and families actually saw themselves as allies and not always sort of like either antagonistic or just sort of neutral, I truly think amazing things could happen. And I think that really is just like the opportunity that we really need to take advantage of.
And final questions, we're running out of time. What do you feel really good about in terms of like your work, since you from the Christine Culp who came in 2013 and Christine Culp in 2021? What do you feel most proud of, and what do you want to build upon professionally?
Mm-hmm. It actually has been a long road to truly centering anti-racism in the work that we do. Like I have, talked about it and been committed to it, and it's been the center of like all the professional development that I seek out in how I orient in any role that I've had, how I've oriented to working with the teachers that I work with. But there's a difference between, having little pieces of impact here and there to actually starting from a place and starting from a vision of our schools currently are not places where Black and Brown students are able to be their best selves and their brilliant best selves. And the root of that is racism. It's not it's not class, but with class actually being deeply connected with race, so both of those things actually being at play. It's not, whatever culture of poverty, when that was a big thing, big part of the
every 2 or 3 years, it's like a transition, and then
oh my goodness. I was not a teacher when that was the big seminal work that everyone was talking about, but I was training teachers when it was. And so I'm glad that has sort of fallen a little bit out of favor, although I think there are some people who still ascribe to that. It's, not because their families or parents don't care about education, whatever, all of those narratives that have been created. And so I think that has actually been a long journey to get there. And I'm really proud that there actually has been a really clear stance and like, nope, like this is where we're going to go, and this is where the journey is going to continue through this lens and through this understanding of what the root cause is.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I can keep asking you questions and I can keep talking. But it's an hour, and I know you're a busy woman. So we're going to shut things down. But I just want to say thank you for just, just being a source of information, for being open-hearted, for being knowledgeable, and still like talking about, I think, areas of professional struggle and personal growth. And I want to say, I think that you're a really great example for other professionals out there who fall outside maybe the black-white binary or are in it, it doesn't matter, and just to be more honest about our experiences and how we view the world and ways in which that world changes over time. So just thank you for your time and thank you for being here and qualitatively speaking with me. And I wish you all the luck too. And like Columbia, I know you've probably been there for over a year, but I hope, I hope you enjoy it. What was it like to make that shift? Was it nice? Different?
I'm glad that I did it before the pandemic.
Sure, sure.
um,
Yeah.
but yes, it's been nice.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much again. And I'm just going to close out for everyone. All right. Take
Well,
care,
thank
everybody.
you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am. Have a good one.